Hi everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Shemos. This is a really chock-full Parsha. We're brought all the way from Bnei Israel settling and being enslaved in Mitzrayim to Moshe's birth and eventually his emergence as the leader of the Jewish people. It's kind of your classic hero tale, origin story type of thing. But today we're going to focus on something different, which is the role of the 5 women surrounding Moshe that really facilitated and enabled his storyline to even take place. And those 5 women are his mother Yocheved, his sister Miriam, the 2 midwives Shifra and Pua, and of course his adopted mother and the daughter of Paro, Baya. So it's interesting to note that in Judaism there are 2 archetypes, different types of power that exists in this world. There is the male archetype and the female archetype. And the Gur Aryeh says that these 2 archetypes or presence of power in the world are not limited to just men being the male archetype and women being the female archetype, but rather they're just 2 ways of classifying everything in the world. As we know, all Hebrew words, in fact, are either male or female. And they're just two representations of different forces that exist that are utilized at different times depending on the need. So the male archetype is really focused on intervention, confrontation, power. It's sort of like in your face. It's powerful. It's aggressive at times. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And of course, we know that this is really what the Western world values almost exclusively, even as opposed to the Eastern world, which a lot more values the feminine archetype, which is all about nurturing and relationships and cultivation. It's less in your face. It's less splashy, but it nevertheless has so much that it can do and accomplish. So we're going to learn about how these 5 women surrounding Moshe really utilized the feminine archetype to contribute to the redemption of the Jewish people. So the first one, it really all starts with Miriam, right, his sister. We know that Paro had decreed that all Jewish baby boys should be thrown in the river and killed. He did this because he had a correct prediction that there would be a male rising up from the Jewish people that would rebel against him and cause him problems. So in response to that, Amram, who was Miriam and eventually Moshe's father, he was a leader of Bnei Israel, and he decided to just divorce his wife Yocheved altogether, thereby avoiding any chance of any babies being born and, facing this really harsh reality. Miriam came to him and said, how can you do this? Paro's decree only threatens the lives of the baby boys, but by separating from your wife and not having any children, you're also threatening the existence of any baby girls that might be born. Also, Paro's decree is only threatening the baby's olam hazeh. You are threatening any potential baby's olam haba by not even giving them the chance to come to this earth. So Amram listened to her. He got back together with his wife Yocheved, and because he was a leader of the Jewish people, everybody else followed suit and also returned to their wives, and more babies were being born. So we see that as much as Miriam intervened, she packaged it in a way that she knew her father would hear. We know that Amram was a perfect tzaddik, and so she really, described the consequences of what he was doing to him in language that she knew would penetrate, and she knew that he would really connect to and understand. The next one is Yocheved, Moshe's mother, and her kind of courage and her role in this is not necessarily, again, that she intervened or did anything drastically different or took a stand or asserted, but she continued to live her regular family life despite the surrounding circumstances, right? She allowed herself to get back together with her husband. She allowed herself to become pregnant, to carry a pregnancy despite the turmoil surrounding her and the immense danger. She, of course, gave birth to Moshe. She hid him for 3 months in her home. And then she devised a plan to save him, which included sending him out of her house, right? Eventually, he came back to her. She was the wet nurse, but she didn't know that at the time. So her kind of courage and her role and the stand that she took was in continuing to trust in God, continuing to play the same part she had always played, which was the builder of her family, despite everything going on around her, and despite all the danger involved. Then we have Shifra and Pua, and we know, of course, that Paro ordered them to kill any baby boys that were born, and they simply refused. They didn't protest, they didn't confront him, they didn't really take any kind of a stand except sort of through the route of civil disobedience. They simply refused to follow through with his orders. They instead continued to follow, Hashem and more what they considered was the right thing to do, what was moral, and they just avoided action instead of taking action. They finally were called before Paro to sort of explain why no Jewish baby boys had been killed, and they made up an excuse that the Jewish women just gave birth before they could get there, and they kind of just sidestepped the whole issue. They didn't even really address his concerns. They just kind of sidestepped it, and it was through their inaction that all these babies were born. And the word that it uses to describe what they did is vetachayana. They let the boys live, which is, of course, a very sort of a passive word. They allowed the boys to live. They just didn't intervene in any way. Then we're brought to Batya, who is Paro's daughter, and of course we know that she adopted Moshe. She was bathing outside. Some say that she was in the process of converting to Judaism, and she was attending the mikvah outside in the river. And of course, she sees Moshe in his basket, which again, Miriam was sort of standing, not doing anything, but standing on the side, watching what would happen to him. Again, keeping track of him and protecting him, but through inaction more than like directing where he would end up. So Batya sees Paro, and her instinct is to go save him. She understands that God wants her to save him, despite the fact that it's against her father's wishes. And her maidservants who are outside with her say, "How could you possibly go against your father's wishes?" Right? It's one thing for other people to defy him, but you're his daughter. Nevertheless, she of course saved him, and even that was in a passive way. Moshe kind of floated near to her, and Rashi says that she didn't even go too far out into the water. She just stood where she was, and her arm miraculously stretched out, and she was able to retrieve Moshe. So all of these sort of like ways that they contributed to the story, that they allowed this story to happen, they allowed Moshe to survive and to thrive and to become who he was sort of through the process of inaction, which again, I think as Westerners, at least most of us, sometimes it's hard for us to understand the value of. And this concept of strength through avoidance or through avoiding intervention exists in other areas as well in Judaism. The Shari Aaron says that if you have the opportunity to do a sin and you don't, and simply by avoiding it, you get a mitzvah for that. So there is such a thing as inaction being counted as almost an active mitzvah because it still has so much value and there's so much that can be done through inaction. We know that in Koheles, there's an entire chapter that says La kol zman va'es, right? There is a time for everything. And all the phrases that come after that La kol zman va'es are sort of counterparts. So half of the phrase really speaks to something that is very actionable and direct, and again, sometimes aggressive and intervening. And those are a time to be born, a time for planting, a time for slaying, a time for tearing down, a time for throwing stones, a time for embracing, a time for seeking, a time for ripping. They're all very actionable, right? These are things that you have to actively do. And then the counterparts in all of these phrases are things that are much more passive. They're nurturing. They're things that are sort of slow and quiet, and they take patience and understanding to sort of develop. And those phrases are a time for dying, a time for healing, a time for building up, a time for gathering stones, a time for shunning embraces, a time for losing, a time for discarding, and a time for silence. So we know that some of the most central words in Judaism, including Torah, Neshama, Shekhinah, these are things that connect directly to the soul and to really some of our spiritual essences. They're all feminine words. And Aryeh Kaplan says, in fact, that the term bas kol, which means a heavenly voice, is a feminine term, bas kol instead of ben kol, because the actual voice itself, when someone hears the heavenly voice, is described as soft and it's subtle and it's not splashy and it's not in your face and it's not loud. And he was saying that that's a positive thing, right? And so much of our spirituality that we really experience, the hallmark of really things that inspire us, are usually things that are pretty subtle, they're nuanced, they're not necessarily in your face, they're not necessarily things that speak the same way to everybody, and they're often things that are deeply meaningful and moving, but sometimes are even hard to put into words. So we see that the feminine characteristics, are not just limited to women, like we said. In fact, Batya is actually compared to Abraham in the sense that they both defied their upbringings and chose their own path, but not through clashes and confrontations and going head to head against their parents, but simply by doing not only their own thing and following their own path, but doing what they knew God wanted from them, right? Simply sticking to that path despite everything going on around you is a value in its own right, as opposed to outright confrontation, which is also sometimes needed. And of course, in English words, other terms we might use to describe this sort of power is resilience, hope, flexibility, all things that are so necessary in so many times in life. So I encourage us all to, number one, explore maybe our understanding of the male and female archetype in Judaism and in life. Maybe try to combat some of our own biases, which definitely exist simply because of the world that we live in. Understand that the Torah values both of these powers immensely, and it's just about la kol zman va'es. There is a time for everything. We have to make sure that we're utilizing the right tool at the right time. And for this week especially, to acknowledge and appreciate and celebrate the women that contributed to and enabled the redemption of the Jewish people through their unique and feminine role. Good Shabbos.